All right, folks, welcome to According to Sam. This is episode 376. Thank you for joining me. We are going to pick up where we left off in the last podcast. We in the last podcast, went through many of the major Jewish prophets and their prophecies over centuries, predicting that the kingdoms of Israel and Jerusalem, or the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, would be destroyed. And they were destroyed, but these prophets also prophesied that that after God had scattered the people, the Jewish people, throughout all of the earth, and they went first, the northern 10 tribes were scattered around 700 AD. Then 100 years later, the northern 2 tribes, the kingdom of Judah, is scattered, and exiles are taken back to Babylon. And we were reading that the prophets, these major prophets like Isaiah, like Amos, like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they all prophesied, even going back to Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, that they all prophesied that God was going to forgive the people and then also bring them back and to restore them and to restore the nation of Israel. I say nation and not kingdom. Very important, because prior to the Babylonian captivity, what we're dealing with is a kingdom. The Judah had kings. They had Hezekiah, Josiah, Manasseh. These are all kings that they had, and Judah was a kingdom. Israel today is not a kingdom. Israel today is a nation, a state, but not a kingdom. Very important. So, we're going to get into some Jewish scripture today. Well, not scripture. We're going to talk about what the Jewish text is, the Hebrew text, the Tanakh. As I said in the last podcast, we didn't get to it, but we're going to talk about what the Tanakh is, and we'll get started with this short clip in today's podcast.
In 60 seconds, I'm going to tell you the difference between the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the Tanakh. Spoiler, they're all the same thing. What the Christian community typically refers to as the Old Testament is actually the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And the Tanakh is actually an acronym. Torah, or the instructions, or the law. Nevi'im, which I think the technical translation is spokesperson, but it's referred to as the prophets.
The technical translation of Nevi'im is spokespersons, but this section of the Tanakh is the prophets. So the prophets that we all read in the last podcast, the Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Amos, who am I forgetting? Well, those are the ones that we read in the last podcast. They will all be in this section of the Tanakh. Tanakh is the Torah, the first 5 books. We're getting ready to look into this in detail. First 5 books of the law of Moses is called the Torah. And then the Nevi'im is the prophets, and then the Ketuvim. Sorry.
In 60 seconds, I'm going to tell you the difference between the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the Tanakh. Spoiler, they're all the same thing. What the Christian community typically refers to as the Old Testament is actually the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And the Tanakh is actually an acronym. Torah, or the instructions, or the law. Nevi'im, which I think the technical translation is spokesperson, but it's referred to as the prophets. And the Ketuvim is the last section of the Hebrew Bible, and it's the writings. All
right, so the Ketuvim is the writings. We'll look at it here on the Wikipedia page of the Hebrew Bible. You'll see here that the Torah is the first 5 books. Christians called the Torah the Pentateuch, Penta, meaning 5. Tukos is scrolls. So 5 scrolls. Pentateuch is what Christians call it, but it's the same thing as the Torah, the first 5 books. Then you have the prophets, the Nevi'im, and then you have the writings, which in the Christian text you have, which would include the writings, would include the poetic and the historical writings. The Nevi'im basically only has these three prophets included in the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then you have the minor prophets, all from Hosea to Malachi. You should notice that in the Nevi'im, and we're not going to talk about why in this podcast, but you should notice that Daniel is not included in the Nevi'im. It's very important that you understand this and ask yourself why. We may get into this in the next podcast, talk about why Daniel is not included in the prophets. Daniel is one of the greatest to Christians. This is why I was explaining to you when we were going over Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that if you are a Jew, and this is a Jewish text, if you are a Jew reading any of Daniel's prophecies, and Daniel's prophecies are so accurate, he's probably one of the most accurate prophets that is clearly, what he prophesies clearly comes to pass more than any of these prophets. Particularly this one, which is not necessarily a prophecy, but it's a dream about what's going to happen that Nebuchadnezzar has, and then Daniel interprets the dream. Daniel definitely gives prophecies, though. In the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel, the 70th week, and the conversation that Daniel is having with Gabriel, that Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, who is the messenger angel, only appears in the scripture a couple of times. He appears to Daniel, and he also appears to Mary, and it appears to Elizabeth before the birth of Jesus. But Daniel's having a conversation with the angel Gabriel, the same Gabriel who Muhammad claims he met in a cave that started the Islamic religion. That Muhammad says that he had a conversation with Gabriel. Gabriel is the one who gave Muhammad all of the prophecies that created the Quran. This is the story of Islam, the angel Gabriel. I don't believe that was Gabriel, but Gabriel only appears a couple of times, and he appears and has a conversation with Daniel in the 9th chapter of Daniel, where he does give Daniel, very elaborate prophecies about the Messiah. That's a hint to why it's not in the Nevi'im. But the Nevi'im is the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets from Hosea to Malachi. And then you have the Ketuvim is the writings. This is again the Ezra, Nehemiah, which we're going to look at if we have time to get into today. They have Daniel here in the writings. Daniel in the history and the writings. Daniel is not with the prophets, which is crazy. I mean, I've already hinted as to why, but Daniel gives some of the most accurate prophecies of any of these prophets, and he's not included with the prophets. So this is the breakdown of the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, the Ketuvim, which is the writings and the history. This is in the Christian Bible. You have the same things, and then you have the apocryphal books in some Christians. I think Catholics have the apocryphal writings in their canon. But this is the way that the Hebrew Bible breaks down and how it corresponds with what Christians call the Old Testament. Now, the New Testament in the Christian Bible is something totally different. The Jews don't believe in the New Testament. They don't believe in Jesus, and that's something different. Something else that is different is the Talmud. The Talmud is different from the Tanakh. The Tanakh has the historical writings of the Jews and everything that happened in the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, under the kingship of David, under the kingship of Solomon, the history, the prophets who prophesied to the people directly from God, the Torah, the law of Moses. That this is all part of the Jewish history prior to the Babylonian captivity. The Talmud comes after the Babylonian captivity. Now they tell you that it was oral, that you have the oral Torah. This is what they say. According to rabbinic Judaism, oral Torah or oral law are statutes and legal interpretations that were not recorded in the 5 books of Moses in the Torah. So they're legal interpretations. This is what the oral Torah is, the oral laws that were passed down, that they say passed down through generations. It wasn't on paper, so we have to take their word for it, that it was passed down word of mouth through the generations. Prior to the Babylonian captivity, you had this oral Torah, is what it says, going back to Moses, but it really expanded after the Babylonian captivity, this idea of this oral law. And again, it's not written down anywhere, so we have to take their word about it, take their word for it, that this is something that we in our community, that we spread orally, and then it was compiled after the 1st century into text. And that's where you get the Talmud. It comes from the Mishnah. It's also called the Gemara. I have a few clips about the Talmud that we're going to get into, and we're going to start talking about the Talmud. But I just want you to understand that the Talmud is different from the Tanakh. The Tanakh is the Bible. And in a lot of cases, you'll hear Jews mention in the Torah, and they're talking about all 3 of these. They're talking about the prophets. They're talking about the Ketuvim and the Torah together, and they call all of this the Torah. But the actual Torah is just the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of Moses are actual Torah. But in some cases, you'll hear Jews refer to the Torah, and they're talking about the Tanakh, that it's all of these are the Torah. But that's the way that it breaks down. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. The Talmud is something completely different. The Talmud does not come from God. I mean, you can say that the prophets in the Tanakh, these prophets, they claim that they spoke directly for God, that God speaks to the prophet, and then the prophets prophesy to the people. So we can say that comes from God. The Talmud does not come from God. Talmud comes from rabbis and rabbis' interpretation of what the Tanakh is, what the Torah is. And they say that these concepts were passed orally for centuries. And then after the 1st century, it was finally put on paper. That's what the Talmud is. The Talmud is different from the Tanakh. I have a couple of clips about the Talmud, and we'll start with Professor Abramson.
What is the Talmud? So it's a complicated and long answer, but here's the short answer. The first thing I like to say is the Talmud, also known as the Gemara, those terms are synonymous, is a massive ancient commentary on a document called the Mishnah. And when I say massive, I'm talking about over 5,000 pages, although they're typically numbered in folios, that is both sides of one page, and there are 2,711 of those folios. Now, you might wonder, what exactly is the Mishnah? We'll talk more about it in the next lecture, but for now, let's go on with what exactly the Talmud or Gemara is. It was compiled in late antiquity, which means somewhere between the 3rd and the 5th centuries. Scholars disagree about exactly when the beginning and when the ending of the...
So between the 3rd and 5th century, late antiquity. So this is century after the destruction of the Second Temple. Second Temple was destroyed in the 1st century in 70 AD. And this Jewish professor is telling you that the Talmud was first. They had the oral traditions, and it was oral, and then you had the Mishnah as well. But the Talmud, when all of these different things were compiled, and these commentaries were first compiled, was 200 years, over 200 years, and it's debated when this actually happened, but over 200 years after the destruction of the Second Temple is when the Talmud was finally put into print.
It was compiled in late antiquity, which means somewhere between the 3rd and the 5th centuries. Scholars disagree about exactly when the beginning and when the ending of the process occurred. And it was based on much older oral traditions. We're talking about centuries and centuries older oral traditions that found their way into a document which was edited by a series of rabbis. And this editing process occurred in two basic places. One is in the land of Israel, particularly in the north, and secondly in the land of Babylonia, the Mesopotamian region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. As we'll discuss later, that's why there are actually two different texts called the Talmud. There is the so-called Jerusalem Talmud, which is the one that was composed in the land of Israel earlier, and then a later one which was composed in the land of Babylonia, called, of course, the Babylonian Talmud.
So the Babylonian Talmud is the important Talmud. Now, there are some people that still revere and hold the Jerusalem Talmud in high regard. I mean, they're basically the same thing. But when you hear people talking about the Talmud, they're more than likely talking about the Babylonian Talmud, and it's called Babylonian Talmud is because that's where it was compiled. It was compiled by Jews in Babylonian, and the reason that many of these Jews had gone to Babylon is because they had been carried into Babylon in exile by Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian exile. This is very important that you understand this. Here's another clip about the Talmud. This is what the pages of the Talmud look like, and this guy just goes into his interpretation of what the Talmud is. Take a listen.
I mean, the text itself looks pretty confusing, and that's because it's filled with thousands of pages spread across multiple volumes, and every single page is packed with arguments from potentially dozens of different scholars from all sorts of different timelines in this super packed debate that goes back, potentially even 1,800 years. And these debates,
potentially even 1,800 years. Why does he say that? Because we have to depend on them saying that this has been our oral traditions, that we've spread these orally going back 1,800 years. I mean, potentially, it wasn't on paper or anything, but you're telling us that, I mean, the Torah was written and was on paper. We can see that is an old document, but we have to take their word for the fact that this was a oral tradition. These were oral sayings and oral debates that were going on that were never put on paper until the third and between the 3rd and 5th century. So that's why he says potentially 1,800 years. We don't know. You have to take their word for it because it was only oral.
To different timelines in this super packed debate that goes back, potentially even 1,800 years. And these debates, cover everything from how to properly wash your hands before eating to whether or not you can tear toilet paper on the Sabbath. So, what is the Talmud? It is made up of 63 tractates containing 523 chapters and roughly 2 million words spread across multiple volumes. But it's not just the size of this text that's so overwhelming. It's how every single page looks. From the outside, the Talmud might look like, a book. You start from the beginning, go to the end. But when you actually open it up, each page is almost like a complicated diagram, more than just like a normal book. And the main discussion is typically at the center, surrounded by layers of commentary and cross-reference and additional notes that have been added over centuries and centuries from different rabbis and Talmudic scholars. It's basically like, and I hope this isn't blasphemous, like a hard copy of like Twitter, or X. It's like, okay, here's the discussion. First thing. And then it's this person's response, and then this person's response, and then this person's response to that response, and then this person's response, all the way down.
I like that analogy that it's like Twitter, because that's what it is. The Talmud is not a holy book. I mean, per se, and I'm like him. I don't want to be offensive. But I saw this clip of Charlie Kirk doing one of his campus debates, and someone brought up the Talmud, and he made the analogy that the Talmud was like the Federalist Papers, that the Constitution is the Constitution and the laws that we live by, just like the Tanakh and the Torah has the prophets and the laws. But the Federalist Papers are James Madison and all of these other commentators with their theories and thoughts on what the Constitution says and the application of the Constitution. So I thought that was a good analogy that Charlie Kirk made, as well as that the Talmud is to the Torah as the Federalist Papers are to the Constitution. But it's just commentary throughout the centuries of different rabbis, not prophets, not people that are prophesying and saying that God is talking to me and I'm telling you what God said to me, like Ezekiel, like any of those minor prophets that are in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. No, these are rabbis, and they have, they're human. They're human. That's why the Talmud has so much, crazy stuff in it, is because it's just human commentary, like Twitter, like he said. So that's what it is. I have one more clip. This clip goes further into what it is and explains more about what the Talmud is. And take a listen.
In Judaism, there are 3 very important texts, all of which start with the letter T: the Torah, the Tanakh, and the Talmud. The Torah is actually just the first part of the Tanakh, the other 2 parts being the Nevi'im and Ketuvim. In fact, the word Tanakh itself is simply an acronym, T-N-K, standing for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, or in English, instruction, prophets, and writings. As a whole, the Tanakh is, for us Jews, the complete Bible. So, no New Testament, just what Christians call the Old Testament, minus any apocryphal books, and arranged a bit differently. The Talmud, on the other hand, is not a part of the Tanakh, and hence is not considered a part of the Jewish Bible, which means that it does not carry the same level of authority. The Talmud is a separate
I can't be offensive if this guy's Jewish and he's telling you that the Talmud does not carry the same level of authority as the Tanakh. Just like the Federalist Papers don't have the same authority as the Constitution. So
that it does not carry the same level of authority. The Talmud is a separate book altogether, and in fact, it postdates the New Testament. Well, sort of. You see, the Talmud has 2...
Why does he say, well, sort of? Because it predates in their oral traditions the New Testament, but actually being written down on paper, no, the New Testament predates the writing of the Talmud.
Part of the Jewish Bible, which means that it does not carry the same level of authority. The Talmud is a separate book altogether, and in fact, it postdates the New Testament. Well, sort of. You see, the Talmud has 2 distinct layers, and the earliest one, the Mishnah, meaning to review, reached its final written form around 200 CE.
Okay, so that's true.
However,
the Mishnah was in print 200 years before the first century, so
reached its final written form around 200 CE. However, it contains material that had been passed down orally for many centuries. Traditionally, this oral material is said to go all the way back to the time of Moses, which is why it's also called the Oral Torah. However, from a secular perspective, it more likely goes back no further than the Second Temple period. During that period, it was actually forbidden to write down these oral traditions. But following the destruction of the temple and the subsequent Bar Kokhba revolt, this changed because there was a very real possibility that the traditions would be lost. If you want to learn more about the early rabbis, whose sayings the Mishnah is based on, I actually did a video on that, which I'll link to in the description. The Talmud's second layer, the Gemara, which means to complete, and was written primarily in Aramaic, was added even later. It consists of commentary on the Mishnah that was added around 500 CE in Babylon. Now, as an aside, there's actually a Jerusalem version of the Gemara as well, which means that there's also a Jerusalem Talmud. But since when most people talk about the Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud, that's the one I'll be referring to. But here's the thing. The Talmud doesn't give the complete Mishnah first and then the complete Gemara second. No, instead, on each page, there's a little bit of the Mishnah as well as a little bit of the Gemara. But it gets even more complicated than that. Although those are the only two official layers, most modern versions of the Talmud also include even more layers, such as the commentary of Rashi and the commentary of the Tosafists, both of which date to the medieval period, which is why every Talmud page ends up looking more like a scrapbook rather than a regular book page. Ironically, this format was actually based on medieval texts about Catholic canon law, which looked quite similar. Now, all of these complex Talmud pages are, however, arranged according to subject. There are 6 major divisions called orders, and these are, in English, seeds, which deals with agriculture, festivals, women, which is actually about family law in general, damages, which covers both civil law and criminal law, holies, which is mostly about the temple, and purities, which deals with ritual cleanliness. Each of these orders is then broken down further into tractates. I won't go through them one by one, but here on screen you can see a brief English translation for each one. But all of this is just what the Talmud is comprised of and what it looks like. What's actually more important to understand is the purpose behind the Talmud, because this is where the misunderstandings set in.
All right. So in this video, he goes into how people take things out of context and how because like the other guy said, that it's like Twitter posts. And, some rabbi at some period of time said some crazy things like that Jesus is rotting in hell in excrement is actually in there. He goes through and he breaks down some of that stuff, that there's all kinds of crazy stuff in there, but it doesn't have any authority at all. And people are just reading commentary from different people at different periods of time. That's what the Talmud is. Now, I want to go through this video. This video breaks down all the history that we've discussed, starting with the Babylonian captivity. And it's a really thorough video. And then I want to stop it and break down some stuff that she says here, but take a listen.
When Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah were conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, Jews had lost all sovereignty in the land of Israel, the temple was destroyed, and much of the population was either killed or driven into exile. Every level of society, from the poor farmer to the priests and the king, was profoundly disrupted by the Babylonian conquest. What could get a people through such destruction and social upheaval? After a great run of almost 1,000 years, it looked like the Jewish people would go the way of so many ancient peoples, to the memory of the history books. How could a nation possibly remain intact under these conditions? In a word, Torah. In all of the different meanings that word contains.
In one word, Torah. In all of the different meanings that word contains. I think that's very cute that she says that, because like I've explained to you, Torah only means one thing. Torah means the first 5 books of the Tanakh, the laws of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. That's the Torah. But some people refer to the entire Tanakh as the Torah. And not only is she referring to the Torah, she's also referring to the oral Torah. That's what she's referring to. That's why she says, what's the thing that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do when he conquered the kingdom of Judah and brought all of these 7,000 to 10,000 exiles back to Babylon? He wanted to make them Babylonian. He wanted them to forget their Jewish culture. He had destroyed their temple, which was the center of their culture. That for them to maintain their culture is what she's saying in that video, is they had to have something that they could all hold on to maintain their Jewishness. So they don't become Babylonians, that they don't become products of the culture that they had been exiled into. So the Torah became very important. Not only the Torah, the Tanakh, the prophets, the written scriptures that they were able to bring back to Babylon, but also the oral traditions, the oral Torah that was spread while they were in Babylon became very important. And this is why the Babylonian Talmud becomes very important, because most of this stuff that we know, you may say that it goes back orally all the way to Moses, but we know that these oral traditions and these oral sayings really started to develop and take root during the Babylonian captivity while these Jews were in exile. So that's what she's saying. She's saying that Torah in all of its meanings, not only the Torah, the Tanakh, and the oral Torah, which became the Talmud, is what she's talking about. That allowed the Jews that were in exiles to maintain their Jewish identity and to fight back against becoming Babylonians and adopting the culture of the Babylonians. Now, some of them did, and that's something that is important for you to understand, is that when the Persians conquer Babylon and Cyrus gives a decree to go back and build the temple, not all of the Jews go back. Only a small fraction of the Jews that were there in exile in Babylon went back to build the temple. And over a 70-year period, you had people die in Babylon that were exiles. You had people born in Babylon, and Jews that were born there who had never ever seen Jerusalem, that they were born in Babylon. You had people, a few people that were very young when they were taken into exile, and they were became old at the time that like Daniel, that they were young when they were taken into exile, and then when the Persians conquer, then they're old men. So there were some of those people, but there were some people that died in exile that never went back. There were some people that were born in exile, and when Cyrus gives a decree for them to go back to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple, only a fraction of the Jews went back. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the majority of these Jews that stayed in Babylon, they had lives in Babylon there. Maybe had businesses. Maybe their kids were in school there or whatever, that they just couldn't pick up and go back 70 years later after the exile is over. So what she's saying here is that it was the Torah and everything that the Torah represented, the writings of the prophets, the historical writings, the actual Torah, the oral Torah traditions, is what allowed these Jews to maintain their identity and not become the ones who did maintain their identity and not become products of the Babylonian culture. And that is what inspired them to, when Cyrus comes along and gives a decree for them to go back, the ones who did go back, they felt this need and this purpose to go back because they identified with their Jewishness, and they were reading all these prophets like the ones that we read in the last podcast.
How could a nation possibly remain intact under these conditions? In a word, Torah. In all of the different meanings that word contains. Turns out that it was portable, and the Jewish nation took it on the road with them. The Bible contained the Jews' history and their national identity. It gave them laws for daily living. It reminded them of the holy festivals and contained the texts that they would read publicly in the synagogue, which would become their miniature temple. The Torah provided them with sacred language for prayers, and by reading, studying, and praying in the original language, they ensured that the Hebrew language would not disappear. The Bible also spoke to the unity and unique mission of the Jewish people, providing the glue that kept the people together during these troubled times. And it offered the promise of redemption from exile, which came to pass, as Jeremiah had predicted, after 70 years. That's when the Persians entered the scene after their conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE. Let's see where the Jews were when the Babylonian exile came to an end. First, there were the 10 tribes who had lived in the northern kingdom before it was conquered by Assyria. They had been forcefully deported to places where they were separated from their countrymen and made to assimilate with the peoples around them. Some small groups may have left the region altogether for East Asia and Africa, remaining together, while also taking on new national identities. Traces of such populations have cropped up throughout history, especially in recent years, with ramifications for the modern state of Israel. For example, there's a group of Jews in eastern India who call themselves B'nai Menashe and trace their lineage to Menashe.
So we talked about the B'nai Menashe Jews in India. We talked about the Jews that they even found in China. We talked about the Sephardic Jews, the Mizrahi Jews. We talked about the Balhai Jews in Africa, the Jews in sub-Saharan Africa, the Ashkenazi Jews in Northern Europe, these different Jewish communities that were spread as the diaspora was spread, beginning with the Assyrian captivity and the destruction of the northern 10 tribes, but along with the Babylonian captivity, and then after the Babylonian captivity, they come back, they rebuild the temple, rebuild the city, and then the Romans destroy the temple. The Romans destroy the city, and then the diaspora scatters again. There are all these Jews everywhere, all over the world, and the Zionist movement that started in the late 19th century in Eastern Europe started predominantly with Ashkenazi Jews. That's not debatable. That you have all these Jews everywhere that are some of them aren't even thinking about going back. Just like the Zionist movement after the Babylonian captivity. There have been 3 Zionist movements, 3 movements of Zion. The first movement of Zion was led by Moses, and Moses leads after the Exodus movement of the people is what Bob Marley said. So that's the first Zionist movement, the movement of the people after the Exodus. Moses takes the people to the River Jordan. Joshua takes them over the river, and then they conquer the land in the first Zionist movement. And in every one of these Zionist movements, I think it's very important that there was already someone living there when they showed up. Even in the second Zionist movement, we know for a fact that that's the case with the third Zionist movement, because we see the conflict that's been going on there for 70 years. That when the Jews come back, that there's already someone living there, and they have conflict with the people that have been living there. When they go back after the Babylonian captivity, after being exiled for 70 years, when they go back, as we get into this, you're going to see that they have conflicts with people that had already been living there, who had been living there after the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. And when they go back to rebuild the temple, they have problems. When they show up with Moses and Joshua, there are people living in Canaan, and they have problems with those people. They have to get rid of those people. There's in 1948, or in the first part of the 20th century and 19th century, when latter part of the 19th century, when Jews started going back to the region of Palestine, there were people already there. Anyway, so we talked about all of these different Jews that were spread in the diaspora, even as far as India and China, even as far south as the sub-Saharan African Jews, the Balhai Jews, as far north as the Sephardic, the Ashkenazis in Europe. That there are many, many Jews after the spreading of the diaspora in many different places.
National identities. Traces of such populations have cropped up throughout history, especially in recent years, with ramifications for the modern state of Israel. For example, there's a group of Jews in eastern India who call themselves B'nai Menashe and trace their lineage to Menashe, one of Joseph's sons and one of the lost tribes of Israel. In recent years, they have fulfilled their dream of moving to the land of Israel. For the most part, though, the Jews of the northern kingdom became lost to the rest of the Jewish people. In the southern kingdom, the refugees from the Babylonian conquest of Judah included the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, as well as a portion of the Levites. Some went to Egypt, especially the city of Alexandria. The largest number went to Mesopotamia, the birthplace of their ancestor Abraham. The dispersions left the Jews a fragmented people scattered throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Persia. Despite the hardships and persecution they faced, Jews everywhere rebuilt their lives and communities as best they could. Jewish traditions provided structure for family life. The education of children, the responsibilities of each family member, and even meal times were regulated to some degree by Jewish law. That same law guided the family in its relationships with the larger community. The people had to pay taxes and give charity. When Shabbat was observed on Friday nights, it brought all commercial life to a stop, and families came together. According to the traditions recorded by the rabbis, when the holidays arrived, the community joined in prayer at the synagogue and prepared festive meals for their families and guests. Torah study gave the Jews knowledge of their past and the roadmap for their future. And of course, the inner spiritual life of the Jew in exile was inspired by the prophecies and belief in the one true God, who would surely bring them out of exile and back to their homeland when the time was right. Without their portable Judaism and God's promise, it seemed likely that the Jews would have disappeared from the face of the earth entirely. As we mentioned, many Jews eventually ended up in the Persian Empire. The descendants of the Jews seized and deported from Judea by Nebuchadnezzar became a large and flourishing community. Over time, Jewish learning centers flourished there, and many scholars and prophets were prominent in the royal palace, like Daniel, advisor to the Persian kings. The most important Persian ruler, from a Jewish perspective, was Cyrus the Great. When the Persians defeated the Babylonians, they also inherited their territory, which included the land of Israel. Cyrus issued a proclamation that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their land and rebuild the temple. Now, it's true that Cyrus adopted a similar policy toward other nations that had been vassal states of Babylon, but hey, he still earned a lot of goodwill in the hearts and minds of the Jewish leaders. In fact, they looked back at the Persians as being the best of the foreign rulers over Israel and even spoke highly of them. About 45 years after Cyrus left the scene, in the year 4...
All right, so Cyrus the Great, we've been talking about him for the past couple of podcasts. He comes to power just like Daniel predicts in the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Again, in Daniel, second chapter of Daniel, the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is that the Babylonian captivity would be conquered by another kingdom. The Babylonian kingdom would be conquered by the Persian kingdom, and then the Persian kingdom will eventually be conquered by the kingdom of Macedonian Greek. The Macedonian Greek kingdom, which we'll get into in a future podcast, and then the Romans conquer the Greeks. And so that is what happens in Daniel's old age. Cyrus and the Persians, the Medo-Persians, conquer the Babylonians, and then Cyrus gives the edict to return to Zion, that he allows the Jewish exiles, but not only the Jewish exiles, as she said, the exiles that the Babylonians had brought from many other regions to return home, and he allowed the Jews to turn home. But the specific reason was, and we read this in Ezra and other places, the reason that they returned to Jerusalem was not just to build the city and rebuild the nation, but to rebuild the temple. Now, something very interesting that you need to understand too, getting back to this concept and this word kingdom. Kingdom is very important. That before the Babylonian captivity, what you were dealing with were kingdoms. Before the Assyrian captivity, there were kingdoms. There were two kingdoms. You had kings in Judah. You had kings in Israel, the kingdom of Israel. Hezekiah, Manasseh, Josiah. All these people were monarchs. They were kings, and they ruled over a domain, which means a kingdom. So after the Babylonian captivity, when Cyrus gives a decree for the Jews that chose to go back, and only a fraction of them went back, many of them stayed in Babylon. And that's how you get the development of the Babylonian Talmud, is because many of these Jews stayed in Babylon. But the ones who did go back, they didn't go back to recreate a kingdom. They were a kingdom before the Babylonian captivity. They were a kingdom all the way from Saul to the Babylonian captivity. They were a sovereign kingdom from David, from David to Solomon to Jeroboam, Rehoboam. All of these were monarchs. They were all kings. And remember that God told David when he anointed him king that you're going to have a kingdom that lasts forever. One of the members from your family is going to sit on the throne of the kingdom that you establish forever. That's what God tells David when he anointed him. But when they go back after the Edict of Cyrus, they don't create a kingdom. There's not a sovereign kingdom in Israel, a Jewish kingdom, until the Husseinian dynasty, which happens after the Maccabean revolt. For 400 years, when they go back and they rebuild the temple, they're not a kingdom. They're either under the authority of the Persian Empire, and then when the Greeks come to power, they're under the authority of the Greek Empire, and then you have this short stint of a monarchy and a kingdom after the Maccabean revolt before the Romans come to power, the Husseinian dynasty. This is the first thing. And this is not, the Husseinians are not part of the line of David. So this is not the same monarchy that God tells David is going to last forever, and you're going to have a member of your family sit on this throne forever. The Husseinian dynasty, they weren't from the line of David. So that's why I tell you, when we talked about Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's interpretation of that dream, that if you're Jewish and you don't believe in the Messiah, you don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and that he comes from the line of David and that he established the kingdom, like he said over and over again, my kingdom, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, what Jesus said over and over. If you don't believe in that, then your concept of what Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is completely different than a Christian interpretation who does believe that Jesus is from the line of David, that Jesus established or didn't establish, but he carries on the kingdom and the rule from the line of David. If you don't believe that, then you're reading into Nebuchadnezzar's dream. You're reading something else when you read about this final kingdom. These are 5 kingdoms that we see with the statue, but in the interpretation of the dream, there's this final kingdom that is not cut from hands, that comes and it strikes the statue at the feet, destroys the whole statue, and then grows into a mountain. That's the 6th kingdom, and that 6th kingdom would last forever. If you don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, and you don't believe in the kingdom that Jesus taught about, then you're reading and understanding of this prophecy or this interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, you're reading it totally different. So that's important for you to understand, is that when Cyrus gives the edict for the Jews to go back from exile, only a fraction of them go. And they don't go to establish a kingdom. They're under the rule of the kingdom of Persia. They're under the rule where after the Greeks conquer the Persians, then the nation is under the rule of the Greek Empire. So when Cyrus gives the edict for the Jews to go back, the fraction of Jews to go back, build the city and build the temple after he conquers Babylon, who leads that movement? Who leads that Zionist movement? We know Moses and Joshua led the Zionist movement in the first Zionist movement, when they go from the Exodus to take the promised land for the first time, that Moses led them through the wilderness. And Aaron and Joshua was the leader who led them over the Jordan and to take the city. Who was the leader that led the people back from exile when Cyrus gives the edict for them to go back and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple? And it was this guy, Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel was not a king He was a governor. He was under the authority of the Persians, and he was made the governor. He's the first governor of the new, the rebuilt city and rebuilt temple after the Babylonian exile. He leads the people back from Babylon, back into Jerusalem to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel was a descendant from the line of David, from all the kings of David. Jeconiah was his grandfather. His great grandfather was Josiah. So all the kings that were the kings of Judah, before the Babylonian exile and the Babylonian captivity, Zerubbabel descends from those kings and is a descendant of David, but he is not given the crown as a king after the Babylonian captivity because the Persians were in charge and it wasn't a kingdom. So he is given the title of governor. He was the first governor of the rebuilt city and the second temple. He is the one who leads the Zionist movement. He's like the Moses, like the Theodore Herzl or David Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of the current state of Israel. Zerubbabel was that figure to lead the people, the fraction of the Jews, to go back and build the city. And they have nothing but problems with the inhabitants that were already living there when they do go back. From the second temple period, from Zerubbabel to the Maccabees, those are the 350 to 400 years, that period of time from Zerubbabel, the decree of Cyrus to lead the people back to rebuild the second temple, rebuild the city, to the Maccabees, because the reason the Maccabees are important is because, like I said, the Husamanian dynasty comes for this short period of time. There is a dynasty there, and it comes from the Maccabean revolt, which we'll get into when we go further into this. I want you to listen to this guy. He goes into a little bit about Zerubbabel and who Zerubbabel was.
Zerubbabel, what a name. And this guy was something. He was in the line of David. He was an ancestor of Jesus. You can literally see his name in Jesus's genealogies in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. He led the people of God as the governor of Judah when they came back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. He followed God's plan for his people. And at the end of the book of Haggai, God even said to Zerubbabel, "And I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you." Pretty amazing stuff. So let's talk about him, okay? We first see Zerubbabel mentioned in 1 Chronicles, and we're told that he's the son of Pedaiah, but every reference after that in the Bible, he's called the son of Shealtiel. So there's a debate about how that might be. Maybe he was adopted as Shealtiel's son. We don't know. Everyone involved obviously is dead, so it's a bit of a mystery, okay? But Pedaiah and Shealtiel were brothers. Both were sons of the king of Judah at the time, King Jeconiah, known as King Jehoiachin. So we know that King Jehoiachin was his grandfather and that Zerubbabel was considered the son of Shealtiel. Now, King Jehoiachin, all right, Zerubbabel's grandfather, only ruled 3 months and 10 days. Short reign, and it was a very sad reign. King Jehoiachin had the misfortune of being the king of Judah when the Babylonians took over. Not fun, okay? Which is, of course, an understatement. King Jehoiachin was literally hauled away to Babylon along with his people. And Zerubbabel, his grandson, is born in captivity in Babylon, and his name reflects that. His name literally means offspring of Babylon.
Offspring of Babylon, or seed of Babylon, or born in Babylon. I've heard people interpret it that Zerubbabel, but he was one of these people, like I explained to you. Some people were old when they were carried into exile and they die in exile. Some people were young and carried into exile and they actually get to see the redemption. And they're old, like Daniel, carried into exile as a young man, and then he lives long enough to see the Persians conquer and them to be freed. And then there were people that were born Jewish while in exile, and Zerubbabel was one of those people who was born in exile. He had never seen Jerusalem. He never saw Solomon's temple.
Son is born in captivity in Babylon, and his name reflects that. His name literally means offspring of Babylon. It wasn't uncommon to name your child after what you were going through in the moment back then, which, of course, we don't really do today, especially not naming children after tragic things. So that's a good thing. But they named him Zerubbabel, okay? Offspring or child of Babylon. Of course, Babylon had their reckoning, and Persia took over Babylon under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. So when he's grown, the Persians, they're in charge, and Zerubbabel found favor in their eyes because he's literally selected as governor of Judah and led over 42,000 Jews back to their homeland. He also oversaw the rebuilding of the temple, something the Lord spoke to him about through Zechariah and Haggai, prophets of the Lord, in that time.
So during that time, the major prophets were Haggai and Zechariah. I don't have time to get into some of the things that are written in Haggai and Zechariah, but they were the ones who were along with the caravan that went back into Jerusalem, and they are the ones advising Zerubbabel that this is what the Lord is telling us as prophets of the Lord. This is what the Lord is telling us that he wants you to do, and to rebuild the temple. And he takes charge in leading the people back from Babylon, the fraction of the people who chose to go back. He leads them back, and he begins to build the temple under the advice and the leadership of Haggai and Zechariah.
Haggai, prophets of the Lord, in that time, he worked hand in hand with Joshua, the high priest, and while the rebuilding of the temple was paused for a time under his leadership, he did listen to the Lord through the prophets. He righted his course, he obeyed, and the temple was rebuilt in just 4 years. The second temple, the one Zerubbabel and the people of Judah put together, was the same temple Jesus himself visited, the same one he prophesied would be destroyed. And Jesus, of course, always is right. And he was right. The temple that was built under Zerubbabel's leadership was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. But
all right. So I think that last part is very important. You can go and read about if you're interested. We read a little bit in Ezra, in the last podcast, but Ezra 6 goes into the completion of the temple under Zerubbabel, the dedication of the temple. And like this gentleman says, this is the same temple that Jesus prayed at. These are the ruins of that exact temple that Zerubbabel built after the exile. These are the ruins. These are the walls. This is the wailing wall that they go and they wail at. This is the actual site where Jesus went and prayed at. This is the actual site where Jesus whipped the money changers. These are the ruins of that site, of that temple that has a mosque built on top of it today. These are the ruins of that exact temple that Zerubbabel. The second temple was called Zerubbabel's temple. Just like the first temple is referred to as Solomon's temple, the second temple was referred to as Zerubbabel's temple. And you can read about all of the trials and tribulations and the things that confronted them, the confrontations that they got into with the people who were already living there when they returned from exile. You can read all of that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra comes after Zerubbabel. He leads another contingent of Jews back from Babylon to help out in the building of the city and building of the temple. Nehemiah comes along. Nehemiah is a prominent person in the Persian empire, and he's Jewish though, and he comes along and he helps to build the walls around the city, and that's all in Ezra and Nehemiah. So yeah, that's the podcast for today. We will get back into this in the next podcast. We'll see what we do in the next podcast, but I'm ready to get into the Greek Empire and what happens when Alexander the Great conquers the last Persian king and the rule of the Greeks over the Jewish people. We'll get back into this in the next podcast. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.